Today's story is about a long affair that resulted in a baby, similar to other stories we've shared. Enjoy! I decided to leave, and my spouse responded, "Fine, don't come back." Usually, I would say go to hell when leaving, but this time I didn't want my last words to her to be so harsh. Over our 14-year marriage, we've exchanged such words many times, but this time I won't be returning. In a few days, she might understand the meaning behind my words. Over the past 6 to 7 months, my wife Jenna has become increasingly hurtful in her remarks towards me. I couldn't understand why, and to avoid escalating the situation, I began avoiding her as much as possible. I spent more time in the car, coming home late after Jenna and our 13-year-old daughter had already had dinner. Sometimes I found leftovers, other times they were already in the trash. My name is Kurt K. Kaminski, but my full name is David Kurt Kaminski. I'm not a junior. My father is David John Kaminski. I'm an American of Polish and German, French, Irish, and English descent. Although I'm only half Polish, my surname makes me Polish in the eyes of others. Living in a small town, I've become the subject of many jokes about my heritage. Recently, I discovered that my wife, who will soon become my ex-wife, is not the person I thought she was. Her cruel words and actions led me to distance myself from her. One Monday evening, I decided to have a snack at a local restaurant and overheard a conversation in the next booth. It turned out that my wife and my best friend, George Carey, were deceiving me. They talked about how they spent time together while I was busy in the park, unaware of anything. I left the restaurant trying to get away so they wouldn't notice me. It was unbelievable. Jenna was with George, who had even served as the chauffeur at our wedding. He's my mechanic who will still be servicing my cars for some time, although he's not my mechanic but an independent contractor whom I hire for repairs and maintenance. I wanted to hire him, but he said he wouldn't respect himself if he had a Polish boss. He said it jokingly, but I knew he was serious. Regardless, I hired him as my independent mechanic contractor. Although he was not very independent, I was his only source of income. I returned home, and Jenna was as out of sorts as ever. I didn't want to talk to her until I found out the truth. After she went to sleep, I checked her email and found nothing suspicious. However, her phone was secured with a password, which turned out to be our daughter's birth date. I noticed a few messages that could have been misinterpreted, but none from George. The following day at the car dealership, George arrived and made jokes about the Polish. I usually chuckled and let it pass, but today I confronted him. I asked him what he truly knew about Poland and wagered that he couldn't locate it on a map. He looked unsure of what to say, knowing I was correct. George was never one for academic pursuits. He possessed street smarts and mechanical knowledge but had never been a scholar. I suppose that's why he gravitated towards me in high school. I helped him with his studies so he could at least graduate. Now, I find myself reconsidering my choice of companions, making me contemplate my choice of spouse. I retreated to my office, closing the door behind me, pondering how I could gather evidence of what might be transpiring. Confronting them both would only lead to denial. I needed proof. I contacted a private investigator in Santa Fe, expressing my concerns, and he suggested installing a beacon on my wife's phone, allowing me to track its location discreetly. He also mentioned the option of installing cameras in our home but warned that unless I invested in high-quality, expensive ones, they would likely be discovered. I opted for the tracking program he recommended and assured him of payment for his advice, despite his insistence that I owed him nothing. That evening, after everyone had retired for the night, I surreptitiously installed the tracking app on my wife's phone and synced it with mine. It would operate inconspicuously in the background, unbeknownst to her. The next day, I checked the app periodically, noting her whereabouts. She worked part-time at the university bookstore, typically for 15 to 20 hours a week, earning discretionary income which she often spent at the salon. Later, she was at the grocery store before returning home. George, on the other hand, was home for most of the day but coincidentally absent whenever Jenna was present. Determined to mend relations with my wife and daughter, I suggested dining out together. Although my wife seemed somewhat apprehensive, my daughter Carrie displayed typical teenage reluctance. Despite her hesitance, I insisted, and she reluctantly accompanied us. Dinner was pleasant, though I made a point to mention George in conversation. Jenna's discomfort was evident as she quickly changed the subject, further fueling my suspicions. As we settled into bed, I thanked Jenna for joining us for dinner. She responded with gratitude, hinting at intimacy with her gaze. Mixed emotions swirled within me, and I resolved to await concrete evidence before reciprocating her advances. Eventually, we engaged in intimacy, but it was rather mundane. For the remainder of the week, I monitored the location of her phone, finding nothing unusual. On Saturday evening, after she had fallen asleep, I checked her phone for any messages or calls, once again finding nothing. I began to convince myself that George was merely boasting, fabricating tales to impress someone with his intimate escapades. However, as I lay in bed, my subconscious refused to let me rest. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I rose from bed, made my way downstairs for a drink, and decided to check her phone once more. Entering the password, our daughter's date of birth, I unlocked the phone and navigated to the homepage. Suddenly, it struck me like an electric shock. Our daughter's birth date was the key. The pregnancy had been arduous, with moments when we feared we might lose her due to her Rh factor not aligning with my wife's. In the final 3 weeks of pregnancy, my wife was confined to bed rest to ensure she could carry the baby to term. Exactly 9 months after our wedding, Carrie was born. We were overjoyed that she was healthy, but she proved to be a challenging child, with constant crying, difficulty sleeping, and reluctance to nurse. In the second year of Carrie's life, my wife adamantly declared that we wouldn't be having another child. The arrival of our first child had drained much of the joy from our lives. Considering that Carrie was born precisely 9 months after our wedding, she fell into the category often referred to as wedding night babies. A realization dawned on me. If George's claims were true, there was a strong likelihood that Jenna was already pregnant before our wedding night. Jenna had been on birth control pills, and we hadn't waited until marriage to engage in intimacy. In fact, it had been a significant part of our relationship. When questioned about Jenna's pregnancy, the doctor suggested that the stress of the wedding may have rendered the pills ineffective. If they were ineffective that night, it stood to reason they were ineffective before as well. Now, I knew what needed to be done. There was a 50% chance that I wasn't Carrie's biological father. Rising from the couch, I made my way to the bathroom where I retrieved some cotton swabs. I headed to Carrie's room, where she was fast asleep, and carefully swabbed the inside of her cheek. I repeated the process for myself, carefully sealing the swabs in plastic Ziploc bags. Sunday was dedicated to household chores, with each of us having our own responsibilities. I took my time, avoiding prolonged interaction with Jenna or Carrie to conceal my emotions. Although eager to uncover the truth, doubts plagued me throughout the day. Jenna eventually questioned my demeanor, to which I quickly responded with a fabricated explanation about plans for our business. Living in a conservative community, I was cautious not to let business dealings impact my personal life negatively. The idea to pay off credit cards and minimize financial risks stemmed from a desire to shield myself from potential fallout if Jenna were to discover my plans. This sudden realization prompted me to take action. Early Monday morning, I took the samples to Western New Mexico University and consulted with the head of the science department regarding genetic testing. They were accommodating, offering to conduct the necessary tests as part of their cellular and molecular biology program. In return, I offered a 10% discount on any car purchase for those who worked on the samples. As I left the university, I smiled, but it was a concerned smile. The results could potentially end my marriage. When I told Jenna about buying new cars to fill my lot, it was only to hide my worried expression. Now, I thought this wasn't such a bad idea after all. I called Paul, my accountant, loan officer, and part-time salesperson, into my office and told him about my idea. He was enthusiastic, but there was something else I wanted to do: pay off the mortgage on my house. I asked if we could agree on a lump sum payment, and he said he would look at the financials and get back to me after lunch. As I waited for the DNA test results, I thought about calling my lawyer and asking for a referral to a family lawyer. However, I decided to wait and see what the results were first. After all, I had yet to find any evidence of my wife's infidelity. Late on Wednesday evening, the head of the department called me with the results. He confirmed that the two samples collected were not related to each other. Although I had expected it, I was devastated by the news. He gave me a minute to think it over and handed me a manila envelope with the results. When I looked up at him, my expression changed. "So, what car were you thinking about?" he asked. I told him that I was looking for a sports car, specifically a Mazda Miata. He said he didn't have such a car but would try to find one at the auction the next day. As I left the university, I told Anna that I would leave early but would only be a phone call away if she needed me. I knew she wouldn't call. She could handle almost anything that needed to be done. I drove around the city, watching as everything looked different. I called my lawyer, who referred me to another lawyer. After making an appointment for late the following evening, I had a snack at a restaurant and thought about my life. Had I really wasted the last 15 years? I still considered Carrie my child to some extent, but biologically, she was not mine. I knew I couldn't act like I didn't know anything. George would pay and so would Jenna. I wondered if she knew that Carrie wasn't mine or if she had hidden this secret from me. The secret of her intimacy with my best man on our wedding day, and their continued affair, left me feeling angry and betrayed. Before I lost control, I needed to be alone, away from everyone. I called Jenna and told her I would spend the night in Albuquerque to be ready for the auction at 8. Although this was unusual, she didn't question it. I wondered if she would take advantage of my absence, but I would periodically check her phone tracker throughout the evening to see if she decided to go somewhere else. As I drove to Albuquerque, I thought about who I could entrust with the mechanical inspection of the cars I planned to buy. I knew that George would not get any more work from me after his routine inspections and machine repairs were completed. When he heard that I bought 24 cars, he would see $signs, but this would not happen. I needed to keep it a secret until the last minute. I checked into a Best Western hotel, not wanting to spend the company's money on an expensive hotel. The room was comfortable, as was the bed. That's all I needed. I am a simple person with simple needs. When I entered the room, I immediately checked Jenna's phone tracker and discovered that she was still at home, or at least her phone was. That night, sleep was difficult as I kept going over in my mind why she did what she did. How could she justify having a night with him on her wedding day, let alone twice a month for who knows how many years? I began to reconsider our marriage, which was never perfect but had been built on what I thought was exclusive love. The first few years after the wedding were not easy, especially with Carrie's arrival. We had originally planned to wait 3 to 4 years before starting a family, but those plans were ruined by my best friend's betrayal. Now, 14 years of effort seemed wasted, overshadowed by this new revelation. If Jenna hadn't had intimacy with George, maybe she would have gotten pregnant with me, and maybe she wouldn't have had such a difficult pregnancy and child that made her not want any more. George had ruined my life, and he must pay for what he had done. As I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I was furious. I needed to calm down, so I turned on the TV to a mindless comedy show. Laughter helped me calm down, and by 11 p.m., I was ready to fall asleep, looking forward to a long day at the auction. The auction went well, and I got some great cars at great prices. I also got to know some dealers in the Albuquerque area. Although I didn't see any Miatas at the auction, I started asking other dealers and found 2 who had one red, the other black. I asked them if they would be willing to make a deal once I found out what color my client preferred, and they agreed. In the afternoon, when I met with the lawyer, the news was not very good. I would lose half of all my property and would have to pay alimony and child support for a child that wasn't even mine. I decided that I would not get a divorce but would leave Jenna with George's baby. I would pay off the mortgage on the house and she could stay in it, but my name was the only one on the mortgage, so she couldn't sell it. If I moved out but continued to pay taxes and utilities, she wouldn't be able to resign and take the house. However, I had to decide what to do with my business, which was registered as a corporation. I needed to talk to my business lawyer about protecting it from potential loss. When I returned home, I was exhausted from the long day. Jenna asked if I wanted to have dinner, but I said no. I had had a late lunch. At least she thought to ask. The shower was wonderful, and it felt like my problems almost melted away. I had problems, but I was on my way to solving them. I fell asleep a few minutes after my head hit the pillow. I had been stressed for the past week, but now that I had started making a plan of action, my mind could rest. Waking up early and feeling refreshed, I headed to the office before Jenna and Carrie even woke up. I had things to do and even more plans to make. When my staff started arriving, they found me knee-deep in spreadsheets, financial reports, and sales forecasts. I told Paul that I had purchased 23 cars and that within a week, we would close the deal on the car at the dealer in Albuquerque. I told Anna not to assign any more work to George but to keep it a secret. She looked at me with a puzzled expression, but I assured her that she was irreplaceable. At 9 a.m., I called my business lawyer and asked him what I should do to protect my business. He suggested selling it beforehand to keep it out of Jenna's hands, but I told him that my business was my life, and I couldn't get rid of it. I needed to think and study the situation before making a decision. This news was devastating. I had worked hard to build my business into what it is today. However, part of being a good businessperson is the ability to compartmentalize and multitask. I needed to put my personal problems aside and get back to business. First on my list was to call Doug, the department chair who determined that what George said was true. Doug told me about 2 Miatas that might interest me, one red, the other black. He asked which color I was interested in and said he would bring it here so I could look at it and discuss the numbers. Even if we couldn't agree on a price, he was sure he could sell it without too much trouble. I asked him which one he would suggest, and he said each had its pros and cons. Fire red was a great statement color, but it faded faster. Black looked elegant but got hot quickly in our climate. I told him that the car would be kept in a garage when not in use, so fading wouldn't be a problem. He suggested the red one. I hung up and called the dealer who had the red one to arrange a trade. He became interested in the BMW on my property, which had been there for 3 months. George arrived just as I was finishing the call, and he overheard several salesmen talking about the 23 cars that would soon appear in our warehouse. He asked me where the cars were coming from, and I told him they would be delivered sometime at the end of next week or early the following week. He said he wanted to make sure he had a schedule to do this for me, but I told him I would contact Anna and ask her to put him on the schedule. That weekend, I tried to keep my distance from Jenna. I worked in the yard and ran a lot of errands. I didn't even check her phone tracker. It no longer mattered to me. I felt only contempt for her, and the fact that I was raising someone else's child was unforgivable. On Monday, I went to the car show again and called the dealer in Albuquerque. I told him I would drive the Beamer over and pick up the Miata. The trip was pleasant, as was the lunch with the other owner. On the way back, driving the Miata with the top down and the wind ruffling my hair, I decided to call another dealer and get a black car. I needed to live a little, and I wouldn't be needing more than a 2-seater anytime soon. When I pulled into our driveway in a red sports car, Jenna looked out the window and must have said something to Carrie because they both came out to watch. Jenna asked why I needed this car, and I told her I had picked it up for a client and thought she might want to ride in it. However, Carrie said she didn't like small cars, and Jenna agreed with slight contempt. I was stunned. Where did this disrespect come from? When I looked at Jenna, she was acting as if Carrie had done nothing wrong. Now, both women in my house were disrespectful to me. I knew teenagers weren't supposed to be best buddies with their parents, but the hurtful way Carrie said it made me look at my entire family life as a sham. I told them I was going for another ride and drove away, fired up. My marriage was rapidly deteriorating, and when I finally pulled into the driveway at 9:30, I immediately went upstairs, hopped in the shower, and climbed into bed. When Jenna came into the room, she asked if my feelings were hurt because we didn't choose a sports car. I told her that she was not only a disrespectful wife but also a disrespectful mother. I said that I may have to support Carrie, but she was not my daughter, and it looked like Jenna and Carrie would rather not have a Polish man around. The next day I called Doug, and he came to check out the Miata. He was delighted with the price, and when he was about to leave, he mentioned that his best friend was in charge of purchasing for the university and changed 16 cars approximately every 2 years. He asked if I could talk to him, and I said I would be happy to do business with them. On Wednesday, my lawyer called me and said he had a solution to my potential problem. He told me it would take about 2 weeks to implement, but if it worked, it would be worth it. During those 2 weeks, I slowly moved my personal belongings and tools from my home to an apartment in a nearby city. George was anxiously waiting for those 24 cars to arrive so he could do some work and bill me for it. When he asked, I just put him off. That past weekend, I did some yard work, and when Jenna and Carrie weren't around, I cleaned out my closet and drawers. Jenna did laundry during the week, so she didn't notice that my closet was empty. On that Monday night, I told Jenna I was leaving. She started being rude and disrespectful to me again, both as a Polish man and as a used car salesman. In the past, I would go to a motel for a night or two depending on how angry I was. However, this time I had a different plan. The next morning, I arrived at the parking lot early and asked my employees to go to the conference room. I closed the door behind them and started the meeting. I told them that the cars I bought a couple of weeks ago had arrived and were ready for sale. I also told them that we would no longer use George to do any work here. I paused and wiped a tear from my eye. I told them that I had sold the business, but nothing would change as far as their work was concerned. Anna would perform some of my duties and receive a corresponding increase. All of them, even in their surprised state, began to congratulate Anna. They all respected her and knew she deserved it. After the meeting, I asked Anna to talk to me. I told her that I would still be involved in the company but only on an advisory basis and may sell occasionally. I didn't want to take away her sales, and she was glad that I would still be around at least sometimes. As we walked out the door, George was standing there. He asked why he wasn't included in the meeting, and I told him it was a staff meeting and he was not an employee. He stuttered and then said he would get to work on the cars right away, but I told him they had already been carefully examined and prepared for sale. I told him that I had sold the business and the new owner wanted to move in a different direction. He looked stunned, but I wasn't ready to explode at him yet. I left everything as it was and decided to say fewer words. He asked what he should do now, and I told him he could pick up his check for what he did in the last 2 weeks. It wasn't that much. Anna had used his services only a few times. I didn't feel sorry for him. He was basically told that he was out of work. I met with Anna and asked her if she could keep our conversation a secret. I told her that I had created companies that I registered in Nevada. One of the companies would buy the parking lot, and the other would buy the company. I was the sole owner of shares in both companies. At some point, I would divorce Jenna and make sure she didn't get the business. I moved out of my house and Jenna didn't know it yet, but I wasn't going back. She had an affair with George, and Carrie was not my daughter. I believed she was George's daughter. I didn't even know if Jenna knew about this, but they would soon find out. I wasn't going to get a divorce, but I would continue to pay utilities and taxes for our house. This way, she wouldn't be able to say that I abandoned her and took everything. In case she filed for divorce due to irreconcilable differences, I didn't want her to be able to take over the business. The proceeds from the sale would be spent by the time she got her divorce, and I made next to nothing from consulting and a few commissions from sales. Anna could cope with daily operations, and I would be available to call if she had any questions. However, I trusted her and her judgment. I had one more task for her: to order a new sign and letterhead. We were changing the name of the business to further cement in George and Jenna's minds that the business had been sold to someone else. The new name of the business would be Helpless Car. I spelled the name so she had it right, and she looked at me in bewilderment. I told her that someday I would tell her why I chose this name and that it told the whole story. She still looked puzzled, but she trusted me enough to follow my instructions. I left, saying a few words to everyone as I went. I got into my car, an Audi, and drove down the road towards Albuquerque. About 2 hours later, I received a call from Jenna. I didn't expect her to call before the end of the evening, but this had happened many times before. When I left, I would go away for a day or two, she would call, we would talk, and I would come back. Everything would change for a while, and then we would have another fight, and the cycle would start all over again. I decided to answer the call and wait to hear what nonsense she would spew this time. She asked what was going on, and I told her I was going to Albuquerque to pick up a car. She asked why, and I said it was none of her business. She told me that George had called her and said that I sold the business, and she wondered if it was true. I told her that it was true. I had sold the business. She asked if I had gotten a good price for it, and I told her it was none of her business. She asked about the mortgage, and I told her I had used the money to pay off the house. She asked about food, gas, and insurance, and I told her she would have to figure it out. She asked when I would come back home, and I told her I wouldn't come back. She said we needed to talk, but I hung up the phone and turned it off. I knew she would be trying to call me back, but I didn't care. I wanted her to think about what she had done. After calming down from the phone call, I tried to enjoy the leisurely drive to Albuquerque. I knew that the next call she would make would be to George to get more information and to let him know what I had said. When I got to my destination, I turned my phone back on and saw that I had 5 messages. 3 from Jenna, 1 from George, and 1 from Anna. I immediately called Anna and asked her how everything was going. She told me that Jenna and George had called to find out where I was, and she had told them that I didn't own the place anymore and didn't come there anymore. I told her to tell them to stop calling or she would call the police about phone harassment. I thanked Anna for her support and told her that I knew I could always count on her. She told me that I may feel like I don't have any family or friends anymore, but she was there for me, and I was her family. I hung up the phone and wondered if I should call Jenna or George, but I decided to let them stew in their own anger. I went to the parking lot office, where the owner was waiting for me. He had an Audi that I was interested in, and we discussed the trade-in value of my current car. After some negotiation, we agreed on a price, and I drove away in my new Audi. Over the next 2 weeks, I traveled through northern New Mexico, Arizona, southern Utah, and Colorado. I wanted to be nearby in case Anna needed me to come back, but I also wanted to clear my head and think about my next steps. I called Anna several times to check in, and she assured me that everything was under control. During this time, Jenna and George kept calling me, leaving messages that ranged from angry to apologetic to downright nasty. I listened to them but didn't care. When they called to tell me that the credit card had been canceled, I just laughed. When George called to tell me that I was a terrible person for leaving Jenna and Carrie, I laughed even harder. My lawyer called me and told me that Jenna had threatened to file a stay-at-home order if I didn't contact her and come back. I told him not to worry. I had a recording of our conversation where I told her I was leaving, and she told me not to come back. He said he would take care of it and let me know if there were any developments. After about 3 months and 8,000 miles on the road, I decided to return to Silver City. When I arrived at the parking lot, Anna and the rest of the team welcomed me back with open arms. We had a team meeting, and I told them that I was grateful for their hard work and dedication during my absence. I also told them that I had decided to sell the business and move on to new ventures. They were surprised but understanding, and we all agreed to stay in touch and help each other out whenever possible. I left the meeting feeling grateful for the support of my team and ready to start the next chapter of my life. Over the next few weeks, I tied up loose ends and prepared to sell the business. I met with my lawyer to discuss the details of the sale and make sure everything was in order. I also met with Anna to go over the transition plan and make sure she was comfortable with her new role as manager. As the day of the sale approached, I found myself feeling a mix of emotions. On the one hand, I was excited to start a new chapter of my life and leave behind the pain and betrayal of the past. On the other hand, I was sad to say goodbye to the business that I had worked so hard to build and the team that had become like family to me. The day of the sale finally arrived, and I signed the papers, officially transferring ownership of the business to the new owner. It was a bittersweet moment, but I knew it was the right decision for me. I said my goodbyes to Anna and the rest of the team, promising to stay in touch and visit whenever I was in town. As I drove away from the parking lot for the last time, I felt a sense of relief and freedom. I knew that I had made the right decision, and I was ready to start the next chapter of my life, whatever that may be. I had learned a lot from my experiences with Jenna and George, and I was determined to use those lessons to build a better future for myself. In the end, I realized that sometimes the best way to deal with a cheating spouse is to walk away and start over. It's not an easy decision, but it's often the only way to find peace and happiness. If you're in a similar situation, I hope my story has given you some hope and inspiration. Remember, you deserve to be happy and fulfilled, and sometimes that means walking away from a toxic relationship and starting over. Thank you for reading my story, and I hope you'll join us again for more cheating stories. If you're under 18, please don't listen to the next story. it's not appropriate for young audiences. Until next time, take care and be good to yourself.